Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this is part of my series on GCSE history, international relations, from 1919 to 39. So I'm continuing looking at the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the big four was President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Wilson was very different from the other Allied leaders in his attitude towards Germany and towards other defeated nations. Wilson was very idealistic, perhaps naively so. The United States had only been in the war for the last year and a half. 100,000 Americans had been killed in the war. Now, compared to the European countries, that death toll was very low. It seems callous seeing 100,000 people killed is not a lot, but one has to contrast that against the far higher proportion of the population of places like France and Italy that were killed, compared to that of the USA. The USA had under 1% of its population killed, much less than 1%, but obviously even that's too high. So their population was 3 times larger than that of France, so it was not a high casualty figure in proportion to America's enormous population. The United States wasn't invaded during this war, shelled, bombed, and the United States was not adjacent to Germany, so faced no prospect of being attacked by any of the Central Power countries afterwards. It was easier for Wilson to detach himself from the threat of a future war against Germany and take a more long-term and dispassionate view of things. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and he believed he should be a peacemaker. He'd striven to keep the United States out of the war. He'd been re-elected in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And he believed that political decisions must be guided by morality. As a little boy in Virginia, Wilson had seen the American Civil War, his homeland that having been rent by war, he didn't want the world to go through this agony again if it was avoidable. So he wanted to spare the world war forevermore. Nowadays, we're used to seeing American presidents jetting off all around the world on an almost weekly basis, and that's typical of most world leaders. But back then, an American president leaving the United States during his presidency was highly unusual. Wilson sailed across the Atlantic, accompanied by 10 battleships. His wife was shopping in Paris. This was all front-page news. So people were wildly excited. So it garnered so much coverage. Irish separatists invited Wilson to Ireland. He was quarter Irish, asking him to help their separatist cause. But Wilson regarded Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. Ireland was an internal British issue. He refused to be drawn on the issue of Irish independence. A salient fact, which is puzzlingly omitted from accounts of the Paris peace treaties, is that Wilson fell gravely ill during the Versailles negotiation. In fact, he was on death's door. However, that was kept out of the newspapers at the time. The press was very deferential and did not print private information even when it came into their hands, and France has very strong laws on privacy. So the US had to be represented by somebody else. The vice president was back in the United States running the country. However, the person who was Wilson's understudy obviously didn't carry as much weight as him. So Wilson said that this peace to be lasting must be fair. He'd promulgated his 14 points in January 1918, whilst the war had still been on. He said that if the Allies were too hard on Germany, this would build up an enormous store of resentment, and Germany would gather her strength and some decades later come back for a war of vengeance. Wilson also had sufficient objectivity to recognize that the Allies, including the United States, had not been entirely morally pure, so one shouldn't be too judgmental towards their former enemies. This must not be a victor's peace, where the victors claimed to be completely ethical and said that the vanquished were utterly wicked and must be severely penalized. So he said that other countries bore at least a share of the blame for causing the war. So he'd wanted peace without annexations and things like that. He believed that they must promote trade between different countries because commerce would bind countries together. It's a notion that goes back to Aristotle. Only trade can keep the peace because it would be in everybody's interests to maintain peace because we'd all be prospering by each other's prosperity. So he was determined to improve relations between different countries, to forge amity throughout the world. His vision was messianic, to ensure that war never recurred. Unrealistic, It was scoffed at by more hard-headed people such as Clemenceau. Lloyd George was also quite hard-nosed about this, even though Lloyd George didn't quite believe what he was doing. So Wilson's pretensions to this otherworldly morality seemed ludicrous for some of the other Allied leaders, and downright dangerous, because it was not going to clip Germany's wings. So many Americans thought that Wilson was too high-minded, and where was the US interest in all this? So here were some of Wilson's 14 points that he'd unveiled while the war was still on, way back in January 1918. There must be no more secret treaties, because a lot of diplomacy had been behind closed doors, and the public had never been told what treaties had been signed on their behalf. He felt that public opinion would be a check on intrigue and duplicity. People are disinclined to act disgracefully if they're in the full glare of the media. So peoples must not be pledged to go to war without their knowledge or consent, because governments were sometimes signing guarantees of military support without telling their people. All nations should reduce the size of their military and their stock of weapons to the lowest level consistent with national security. Disarming would also cause a détente. And then money could be spent on more useful things, and indeed taxes could be cut, deficits could be paid off. There must be national self-determination. Now, this one really was innovative, a groundbreaker, something which is still tendentious to this day. So many people belong to multinational empires. The nation-state was a fairly new 19th century concept. And in a multinational empire, if a nation wishes to break away and become independent, then that wish must be granted. Conversely, if they wish to stay part of that empire, that must be allowed as well. It's a very problematic issue. So Poland had been wiped off the map in the early 19th century, split between Russia, Germany, and Austria, the third partition of Poland. So the Poles still had a very distinct national identity, and most of them wished to be reunited together and become an independent country. So that must be put into effect. Countries were not to be treated as pawns passed back and forth by the great powers without being consulted as to their destiny. He felt that the great powers had been cynical in bartering away other people's land, just to serve their own strategic and financial interest. Every nation owned itself, was to determine its own future. So the trouble is, what's a nation? Is the United Kingdom one nation, or four, or 3 1/4? It's debatable in all countries. Who's the self? What about an ethnic minority within a nation? Are they part of the self or not? What about diaspora? Are they part of it or not? How do you determine a referendum? There's been a referendum in the UK. A lot of people don't accept the result. An election? That's not clear. Are you allowed to change your mind? How about a treaty that was decided centuries ago? Did that decide it for all time? Can you revisit the issue? So it opens a whole can of worms. More of his points. Tax barriers between countries should be scrapped. Free trade insofar as possible. So customs barriers meant that goods were unnecessarily expensive on both sides of it, were bad for competition, ripped off the consumer. It discouraged trade, and he wanted to promote commerce between nations. They would make each other dependent on each other, and that would keep the peace and de-escalate tensions. Wilson believed that something like the League of Nations must be founded. The idea wasn't completely original. People had come upon this one, but we're back in the 16th century. An organisation for all countries in the world to join. The League of Nations would be a forum for discussing international disputes, and by negotiation, tensions could be reduced, and solutions could be found to disagreements between various governments. People could settle their differences fairly and, most important, peacefully. We could solve all this without resort to war. Many international problems could be solved by cooperation, not confrontation. And it went on, getting rid of the Kaiser and that militaristic system. By the way, he said Poland must have access to the sea. But you see, that point militated against his earlier point about national self-determination. In order for Poland to have a coast, she had to be given territory in which the ethnic Germans were a minority. So you see how he was contradicting himself. You're in a quandary. Do you give them access to the sea, or does national self-determination take priority? Anyway, the Treaty of Versailles was signed at the end of June 1919.